The British Empire was the biggest of its kind that ever existed. An island off the coast of mainland Europe had ruled over a quarter of the Earth's surface, and in such place, the sun would never settle. But soon enough, its long reign was put into grave danger after the end of the German reign of Europe. Through the creation of the United Nations, it was now clear to Britain and their great colonizing pals that they had no choice but to grant her colonial subjects independence. And in the post-war era began a trend of independence movements across the globe, from the Indian subcontinent to southern Africa to the Caribbean. A range of degrees of independence has been declared. Many had taken the road of republics, while the white majority countries preferred to keep Her Majesty the Queen as the head of state. But empires do what they do, and that was to fall. That time finally came for Britain in 1997 when Hong Kong was returned to China. The last major overseas colony had finally slipped out of British hands, and in that same time, the title of an empire had fallen with it.
To the British Grenadiers.
Many colonies were named crown dependencies, but do not let that name fool you, for the crown depended on the colonies for much of its prosperity. The trading empire that Britain had built up through the decades had been ever reliant on its colonies to supply manpower and natural resources. Though Britain was surrounded by many neighbors and fish, trading with them was not as mainstream, as everyone preferred to use their own network of trade. However, things had changed when she noticed the ever-increasing prosperity just over the English Channel. When Germany realized that domination of Europe was impossible through sheer power, the second best thing was economic domination. Thus, the creation of the European Union for peace and prosperity, which were practically the same benefits that an empire offered. This form of empire would bring prosperity to all members, until it didn't. When things are going well for the economy, they keep going well, especially for a tightly knit economic zone, but the same can be said during a recession. An economic burden on a country in the Mediterranean would also be a burden of a country in the Balkans, Iberian Peninsula, or the British Isles. This was an especially big concern for Britain, who were being faced with huge amounts of migration from other EU states, in which they no longer had a say in because of the fact that they joined the Union. And for years to come, mumbles against such problem grew into grumbles, and after years and years, a referendum was finally held to put a decisive conclusion to it all. In 2016, Britain had finally voted to exit the EU, in which I quote, "with an overwhelming majority." Such a result was shocking, even in Parliament, since the ruling party was actually campaigning to receive a no from the public. As the years followed, a painfully treacherous and messy 4 years of debate, resignations, and worries had passed until the United Kingdom finally agreed with the European Union in October 2019. Effective on January 1st, 2021, the United Kingdom was as independent of the Union as were Brazil or Japan. From this point on, Britain again was no longer part of a pillar of the West. As uncertainty rises, some have laid an eye on its former Dominion members, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. An idea known as CANZUK would provide Britain with the empire-like benefits they had enjoyed in the past by the creation of a Commonwealth Economic Union. The theoretical union would enable free trade, free movements of goods, people, and services, a shared military, and market, and with all four countries bearing a high standard of living as well as a high GDP per capita, it could join the United States and the European Union as the third pillar of the West. But CANZUK isn't like any other economic union that anyone has ever seen. For much of history, empires were created through continuous land or very close islands and coasts. Some of the most historically notable ones include the Russian Empire, Venetian republics, Majapahit Empire, and the biggest land empire, the Mongol Empire. It made sense to have your conquered land close by because of the fact that it was much easier to make a central government with it. But as time went by, technologies improved, and that was when maritime empires became mainstream. But maritime empires are weird. Though they kind of do have a central government, it consisted more of a network of trades with each regional government in the colony, which was unlike any that was ever seen before. Many were quite jealous of Britain's sheer size, however, for Britain, it was also a burden that she carried. How come Britain wasn't the third man during the Cold War? Wrong. Unless you weren't. The answer was simple, and that was because their empire was too difficult to maintain. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had their own share of their massive homeland, which was arguably an empire of its own. Unfortunately for Britain, other countries had caught up to reap the benefits of an empire without the massive oceans in between. And as the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, began a time of arguable peace between most countries, and from then on, most countries have decided to stick to their local countries for trade rather than its historical ties. For example, Canada. Her exports are dominated by the United States by a massive 75%, while Britain only has a minuscule 3%. Another example is Japan. After Japan lost World War II, they had fallen completely under the American sphere of influence. However, today, not to Japan's greatest interest, China is Japan's largest trading partner, regardless of its questionable histories. The biggest hurdle for CANZUK is that most economic unions are created through geographical proximity rather than historical proximity. To name a few, the European Union, CARICOM, Eurasian Economic Union, and a couple more. In fact, out of the current major proposed economic unions, CANZUK is the only one that goes overseas to such an extent. It's a harsh reality we are being faced with. However, with high public approval, as well as some sort of government approval on all four ends, the economic union is far from being unrealistic. Who knows, perhaps we will see another day of the empire back again in the 21st century. One thing that we know for sure is that the Queen will still be around to see it happen.